never forget the night we decided to explore that house. Looking back, it's the biggest regret of my life. If I could go back in time, I'd do everything in my power to convince myself not to go. But curiosity has a funny way of clouding your better judgment, doesn't it? My name is Jake, and I've always been the kind of guy who's up for an adventure. Growing up in a small town in Ohio doesn't give you much to do, so when my friends Chris and Emily told me about an old abandoned house just outside of town, I was hooked. The house had been empty for decades, and everyone in town had a story about it. Stories of people who disappeared, strange lights and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Of course, none of us believed the rumors. We thought it was just another spooky old house with a good backstory, perfect for some late-night exploring. Chris was the ringleader, always pushing us to do the crazy stuff. Emily was the brains, making sure we didn't get into too much trouble. And me? I was just the guy who tagged along, always thinking, what's the worst that could happen? That Friday night, we piled into Chris's beat-up pickup truck and headed for the outskirts of town. The house was exactly what you'd expect, old, falling apart, and creepy as hell. The front door was barely hanging on its hinges, and the windows were either boarded up or shattered. The moment we stepped inside, the air felt heavy, like the house didn't want us there. And then we found the door to the basement. The door to the basement was unlike anything else in the house. While everything else was old and rotting, this door looked new. It had no dust, no scratches, nothing. Chris was the first to notice it. "Guys, this is weird," he said, running his hand along the smooth wood. "Why would someone replace a basement door in a place like this?" Emily rolled her eyes. "Maybe they were trying to keep something out. Or in." I laughed nervously, but her words stuck with me. The handle was ice cold when I grabbed it. With a little push, the door creaked open, revealing a set of stairs that disappeared into the darkness. The air that came up was damp and smelled like dirt and mildew. Chris, being Chris, was already halfway down the stairs before I could say anything. "Come on, guys," he called back. "What's the point of coming here if we don't explore?" Emily sighed, but she followed. I was the last one to step onto the creaky wooden stairs, and the moment I did, I felt this strange pressure in my chest, like the house was watching us. As we descended, the walls around us started to change. The wood gave way to stone and the temperature dropped. It felt like we were walking into a cave instead of a basement. "This doesn't make sense," Emily muttered. "This house isn't big enough for a basement this deep." She was right. We must have gone down at least 3 flights of stairs, but there was no bottom in sight. That's when we heard it, the sound of something moving below us. It was faint at first, like a soft scraping sound, but it got louder with every step. By the time we stopped to listen, it was unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Chris grinned, trying to hide his nerves. Probably just rats. But I wasn't so sure. The scraping noise was enough to make my skin crawl, but Chris kept pushing forward. "Come on, it's probably nothing," he said, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. Emily and I exchanged a look, both silently questioning why we'd agreed to this. Still, we followed him deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls around us seemed to close in. What had started as stone now looked rougher, like it had been carved out of the earth by hand. The damp smell became overpowering, mixed with something metallic, something wrong. Then I saw them. Symbols scratched into the walls, faint but unmistakable. They didn't look like graffiti. These marks were precise, deliberate. Emily ran her fingers over one of them. "These are protection symbols," she whispered. "I think." "Protection from what?" I asked, my voice shaking. Chris laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, great. Now we're in some kind of horror movie." The scraping noise came again, louder this time, and closer. My heart raced as I gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam trembling in my hand. "Okay, maybe we should head back," I suggested, hoping someone would agree. But before anyone could answer, Chris's flashlight flickered and went out. "Damn it," he muttered, smacking it against his palm. That's when we saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of my flashlight's beam, darting across the narrow corridor ahead. It was too fast to be a person, and far too large to be a rat. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "I saw it." Chris tried to laugh it off. "Probably just an animal. Let's keep going. We're not turning back now." Reluctantly, we continued down the endless staircase. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had made that noise was following us. And then I saw something glinting on one of the steps, a watch. I picked it up, recognizing the cracked face immediately. This belonged to Matt," I stammered. Matt was a kid from town who'd gone missing years ago. The watch was cold in my hand, far colder than it should have been. My stomach churned as I stared at it, the realization sinking in. We weren't the first ones to come down here. "Let's go back," Emily said, her voice trembling. For the first time, even Chris hesitated. But before we could turn, the stairs beneath us creaked violently, and the ground seemed to shift. "Run!" Chris shouted, and we bolted down the steps as the wood behind us splintered and crumbled. It felt like the staircase itself was trying to swallow us whole. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, we found ourselves in a massive open room. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one covered in a thick layer of grime. The room shouldn't have existed. There was no way the house above could have contained something this big. "What the hell is this?" Emily whispered, stepping closer to one of the mirrors. As she wiped away the dirt, her reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. The Emily in the mirror was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't match her terrified expression. "Guys," she said, backing away. "Something's wrong." Chris moved to another mirror and wiped it clean. His reflection wasn't smiling, but it was staring at him with cold, lifeless eyes. "This is messed up," he muttered. When I wiped the grime from the mirror in front of me, my reflection didn't appear at all. Instead, I saw the shadow we'd seen earlier, standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. "Jake, what's wrong?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. "Something's here," I whispered. The mirrors around us began to tremble, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the room. Then, one by one, our reflections started to move, stepping out of the mirrors. "We need to leave. Now," Emily said, grabbing my arm. But the staircase was gone, replaced by a solid wall. Chris screamed as his reflection reached for him, its lifeless eyes locked onto his. Chris's scream was the kind of sound you don't forget. His reflection had grabbed him, its lifeless eyes fixed on his. Emily and I rushed to pull him free, but the thing's grip was inhumanly strong. "Jake, help me!" Chris shouted, panic tearing through his voice. The reflection's fingers seemed to stretch, its hand wrapping around his arm like a vice. Desperate, I swung the flashlight at the thing's face. The glass shattered, and for a moment, Chris was free. But another reflection stepped out of a nearby mirror. Then another. They moved unnaturally, their limbs bending in ways that didn't make sense. Each one was a darker, more twisted version of us, and they were closing in. "We have to destroy the mirrors," Emily yelled. I hesitated. Breaking the mirrors felt like a risk. What if that made things worse? But there wasn't time to think. Grabbing a shard from the floor, Emily smashed the nearest mirror. The reflection inside screamed, the sound echoing through the room as it shattered into nothingness. Chris stumbled to his feet, grabbing a large rock from the ground. Together, we began breaking mirror after mirror. Each one exploded into shards, sending the reflections back into oblivion. But with every mirror we broke, the room itself seemed to change. The walls began to pulse, almost like they were alive. The floor cracked beneath us, and I could see darkness swirling through the gaps. "Jake, look," Emily called, pointing to the symbols scratched onto the mirror's frames. I hadn't noticed them before. They matched the ones on the walls of the staircase. Suddenly it clicked. The symbols weren't just random carvings. They were holding something back. "Stop breaking them," I shouted, but it was too late. The last mirror shattered, and the room fell into complete silence. That's when the ground beneath us gave way. We fell, tumbling into the darkness, the shards of broken mirrors cutting into us as we hit the ground below. When I opened my eyes, I realized we were back on the staircase. But something was wrong. The steps stretched endlessly in both directions, up and down. There was no door, no bottom, no top, just an infinite void of steps spiraling into the abyss. "Where are we?" Chris asked, his voice trembling. Emily ran her fingers over the wall. The symbols were gone, replaced by deep black gouges that seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. "This isn't real," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be real." But it was. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the walls themselves were breathing. And then we heard it, the same scraping sound that had followed us before, only now it was louder, coming from all directions. "We have to move," I said, pulling them up the stairs. "If we stop, we'll never get out." We climbed for what felt like hours, the air growing thinner with every step. The sound of the scraping grew closer, but no matter how fast we climbed, we couldn't escape it. Finally, a light appeared above us, a faint, flickering glow. Hope surged in my chest and I pushed forward. But when we reached the top, my heart sank. It wasn't an exit. It was another room, identical to the one we'd left, filled with mirrors. Except this time, the mirrors weren't empty. Each one showed a version of us, trapped, screaming, banging on the glass to get out. And in the center of the room stood a figure cloaked in shadows, its face hidden but its presence suffocating. "You were warned," it said, its voice like the grinding of stone. "The staircase never ends, for those who fear their own truths." The mirrors began to crack, one by one, as the reflections inside clawed to escape. And then the floor started to crumble again. You ever walk into a place and feel like it's staring back at you? That's what it was like the first time I stepped into the LaLaurie mansion. The air was heavy, the kind that settles on your chest and doesn't let go. I didn't know much about the place back then, just the usual ghost stories people tell. But by the time I walked out, I'd learned that some stories aren't just stories, they're warnings. Hi, I'm Nathan Reed, but most people just call me Nate. I'm not a thrill seeker or a ghost hunter or any of those guys you see on TV. I'm just curious. Always have been. Maybe a little too much. When I inherited the LaLaurie mansion, I thought it was a fluke, a lucky break that would make for a good story to tell over drinks. I had no idea it would take over my life. When I arrived in New Orleans, the mansion was everything I expected and more. Massive, haunting, and full of history. I wasn't one to believe in curses, but the way people looked at me when I mentioned the house made me uneasy. They'd glance over their shoulders like someone was listening, then tell me to sell it and never look back. But I couldn't. Something about the place pulled me in. The first time I ventured into the basement, it was like stepping into another world. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the smell of damp stone and rust hit me like a wall. At first glance, it looked like any other old cellar. Cracked walls, a few broken shelves, and a pile of debris in the corner. But then I saw it. A door. Small, unassuming, and hidden behind a stack of rotted wooden crates. The door was locked, of course, but that didn't stop me. A few hard tugs and it gave way, revealing a small chamber I hadn't expected. In the center of the room was a table covered in dust, with a leather-bound book and a tarnished mirror sitting on top. The book was old, its pages brittle and yellowed, and the moment I touched it, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to make me freeze. I should have left right then and there. But I didn't. Back upstairs, I couldn't stop thinking about the book. It sat on my desk, staring at me, its cracked leather cover practically begging to be opened. When I finally gave in, I discovered it wasn't just any book. It was Delphine LaLaurie's personal journal. At least that's what the scrawled name on the inside cover claimed. The entries were written in a mix of English and French, with strange symbols filling the margins. Most of it was incoherent rambling, but one phrase stood out. To bind the living and the dead, blood must pay the price. It wasn't just a journal, it was a manual. I wasn't sure what to make of it, so I called my friend Aaron, a linguist who had a knack for deciphering old texts. He was skeptical at first, but when I told him about the mansion, he couldn't resist. When Aaron arrived, we went straight to the basement. "You didn't tell me it was this creepy," he said, shining his flashlight around the room. "You get used to it," I lied. I showed him the book, and his face changed the moment he touched it. "This is intense," he said, flipping through the pages. "These symbols, they're not just decorative, they're part of a ritual." "For what?" I asked. Aaron hesitated. "Binding spirits, or controlling them." We both froze when we heard the sound, a faint sob coming from the corner of the room. The flashlight beam swept across the walls, but there was nothing there. "Let's get out of here," Aaron said, his voice shaky. But as we turned to leave, the mirror on the table caught my eye. It wasn't just tarnished, it was wrong. The reflection didn't match the room. Instead, it showed something else. A figure standing just behind us. My nights at the mansion grew restless. The whispers followed me upstairs, seeping into my dreams. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning I didn't understand. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without answers. One night I decided to record my experiences. If I couldn't make sense of it, maybe someone else could. I set up my camera in the basement, the book and the mirror in frame. "All right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Here's what I know so far." I explained everything, the journal, the symbols, the strange occurrences. My voice felt small in the vast echoing space of the basement. If you're as fascinated by this as I am, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, like the video, and stick with me. Maybe together we can figure this out. As the words left my mouth, the mirror's surface rippled, like a pond disturbed by a single drop of water. I stared at it, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then the whispering began again. Louder this time, clearer. It wasn't just one voice, it was many. Hundreds maybe. They weren't speaking to me, they were crying out for help, begging. And then one voice rose above the rest. "You shouldn't have come here." The camera caught it all. The whispers, the mirror, the flickering lights. But the moment I tried to leave, the door slammed shut behind me. And I knew I wasn't alone. The room grew colder, the air so thick, it felt like I was drowning. And then she appeared. Delphine Lalaurie, her form twisted and shadowed, her eyes glowing with a fury that froze me in place. "This is my house," she hissed. "You are trespassing." I tried to speak, but no words came out. The chains on the walls rattled, their rusted links stretching toward me like they had a mind of their own. The book on the table flipped open on its own, its pages fluttering, as if an invisible hand was searching for something. Delphine moved closer, her figure growing darker, more imposing. "You disturbed the balance," she said, "and now you will pay." In a last, desperate act, I grabbed the book and flipped to the symbol Aaron had shown me. Using the dust on the floor, I scrawled the symbol, whispering the words scrawled beneath it. The chains froze mid-air, and Delphine let out a shriek that shook the walls. The room fell silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. But when I looked back at the mirror, she was still there, her reflection watching me with a knowing smile. The mansion let me go that night, but it didn't set me free. The whispers still follow me, even now. And every time I close my eyes, I see her, waiting. So if you're thinking about exploring a place like this, let me give you one piece of advice. Don't. Some stories aren't meant to be uncovered, and some houses never forget. What happened in that place needs to be shared so everyone can stay alert and believe me. We can't trust anyone in this world, not even those we live with every day. Hi, my name is Emily Carter, and I want to tell you about something that happened to my family. A story so dark, so twisted that even now I struggle to make sense of it. I'm not here to scare you, but to warn you. No matter how safe your world feels, evil can hide in plain sight. I grew up in a quiet town in Lincoln, Nebraska. Our neighborhood was the kind where everyone left their doors unlocked, where bake sales and block parties were the highlight of the month. My family was no different, or at least I thought so. My older sister, Abby, was the heart of our family. At 20, she was kind, funny, and always looking out for me. She worked at a local cafe and dreamed of opening her own bakery someday. But then, one ordinary day, she vanished. At first, everyone thought she'd run away. The police said there was no evidence of foul play, and even my mom, Karen, started to believe Abby had left us by choice. But I knew my sister. Abby wasn't the type to disappear without saying a word. The person who surprised me the most during this time was my stepdad, Mike Davis. Mike had always been the dependable one in our family. He was a high school teacher, beloved by his students, and respected in our community. After Abby's disappearance, he became the pillar my mom leaned on. He comforted her, organized search parties, and reassured the neighbors that we'd find Abby. Everyone called him a hero. But behind that calm, caring facade, Mike was hiding something. Something so horrifying that it would take me years to uncover. What no one knew, not my mom, not the police, not even me, was that Mike had built a secret room in the basement. A soundproof chamber hidden behind a false wall, designed to keep anyone inside completely cut off from the world. And that's where Abby was, for years. By the time I turned 17, I had almost come to terms with the idea that Abby was gone for good. Almost. But there were things, small, strange things, that kept gnawing at me. It started with the noises. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd hear faint, muffled sounds coming from the floor beneath me. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes creaking. But then, one night, I heard something that sounded like a knock. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mike the next morning as casually as I could. "Hear what?" he replied, not looking up from his coffee. His tone was calm, dismissive as always. Like a knocking sound from the basement. He laughed, shaking his head. "Old houses make all kinds of noises, Emily. Don't let your imagination run wild." But it wasn't just the noises. Things started going missing. Flashlights, batteries, cans of food from the pantry. I tried to brush it off as coincidence until I found something in Mike's office. I was looking for my backpack, but instead, I found a small, rusty key tucked away in one of his desk drawers. It didn't look like any key I'd seen before. "What's this?" I asked him later that day, holding it up. Mike's reaction was subtle, but telling. For the briefest moment, his eyes widened, and his hand twitched before he caught himself. "Probably an old key from school," he said with a shrug. "I forgot I even had it." His words were casual, but something in his voice made my skin crawl. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the key. When I finally worked up the courage to go down to the basement, I brought it with me. The basement was just as I remembered, dark, damp, filled with boxes of old junk. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd. A section of the wall looked newer, cleaner. My heart raced as I ran my fingers along the wall, searching for anything out of place, and then I found it. A tiny lock embedded in the wood. The key slid in perfectly. My hands trembled as the key turned, and with a soft click, the hidden door swung open. What I saw inside made my breath catch. The room was dim, illuminated only by a faint, flickering light bulb. The air was thick, stale, and smelled of mildew. There were piles of blankets on the floor, scraps of food wrappers, and a person. It was Abby. Her face was gaunt, her hair tangled and unkempt, and her eyes were sunken, as if she hadn't seen daylight in years. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. She turned toward me, her wide, teary eyes locking with mine. "Emily?" she whispered, her voice weak but unmistakably hers. "Abby?" I croaked, my voice breaking. I rushed to her, dropping to my knees and wrapping my arms around her. She clung to me, sobbing into my shoulder. "You found me," she said between gasping breaths. I thought no one ever would. I pulled back to look at her, my mind racing with questions. How long have you been here? What happened?" "It was Mike," she said, her voice trembling. "He locked me down here. I don't even know how long it's been, but I never stopped hoping someone would find me." Her words hit me like a freight train. Mike. The man who had comforted us. The man who had helped organize search parties for Abby. The man who had smiled through our family dinners. He had been hiding her beneath our feet this entire time. "We have to get you out of here," I said, standing and pulling her up with me. But Abby was weak, too weak to stand. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "You have to go. Get help. He'll be back soon." I looked at her, my heart shattering. "I won't leave you here, Abby. Not again." "You don't have a choice," she said, her voice urgent now. "But promise me something. When you tell people about this, make sure they understand. Make sure they know the truth." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "And now, to everyone watching this, I want to ask you, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. Abby's story deserves to be heard, and your support helps make sure these stories never stay hidden. But I knew one thing. Mike wasn't going to let us escape without a fight. I locked the hidden door behind me and ran upstairs, my heart pounding. I needed to act fast. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911, but before I could explain everything to the dispatcher, the front door creaked open. Mike was home. "Emily?" he called out, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "What are you doing up so late?" I froze in the hallway, clutching the phone to my chest. The dispatcher was still on the line, but I couldn't let Mike hear me. Just, looking for something," I called back, forcing my voice to sound normal. His footsteps echoed through the house, growing closer. "You've been snooping, haven't you?" My stomach turned as he appeared at the end of the hallway, his face unreadable but his eyes cold. "I know what you've been doing," he said, his voice low now. "You've been down there." Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing my wrist and knocking the phone out of my hand. I screamed, struggling against his grip. "Let me go," I yelled, kicking and clawing at him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice full of anger and desperation. "I had no choice. She would have ruined everything." I managed to break free and sprinted toward the front door, but Mike was faster. He grabbed me again, slamming me against the wall. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police were here. Mike panicked, his grip loosening just enough for me to shove him away and run outside. The officers stormed in moments later, tackling him to the ground. It wasn't long before they found Abby. When they carried her out, she looked at me, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "Thank you." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Mike was arrested, charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and abuse. Abby was taken to the hospital where doctors said she'd make a physical recovery, though the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had come to never finding her. If I hadn't followed my instincts, if I hadn't trusted the little signs, Abby might still be down there. Now, as I tell you this story, I want you to remember, trust your gut. Pay attention to the things that don't feel right. And never assume that evil isn't lurking, even in the people you think you know. Thank you for listening to our story. I never thought I'd be telling this story. It's not just chilling, it's unforgettable. It's about 3 women who vanished in a house that became a living nightmare. And I promise, you'll never look at your neighbors the same way again. My name is Mike, and for years I've been drawn to stories that stick with you, the ones that force you to question everything about humanity. This story begins in a quiet neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, a place where people trusted their neighbors and believed nothing truly bad could ever happen. But they were wrong. It started with Emily Parker, just 20 years old. She disappeared one rainy night in 2002 while walking home. People thought she ran away because she'd had a rough time with her family. Then Rachel Miller vanished a year later on her way back from her part-time job. She was only 19. By the time Sarah Collins, just 16, disappeared in 2004, the community was on edge. For years, their families searched, hung posters, and pleaded for answers. But no one could have guessed the truth. The girls were just blocks away, trapped in the basement of a man everyone thought they knew. Arthur Caldwell's house was like any other on the block. Small, with a rusting chain-link fence and a half-dead lawn. But behind that ordinary facade hid a nightmare. His basement wasn't just a basement, it was a prison. Chains hung from the walls like vines in a jungle of despair. The air was damp and heavy, the smell of mildew suffocating. A single dim light bulb flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed alive. Emily was the first to be taken. Arthur had lured her in by pretending to offer a ride on that rainy night. Rachel and Sarah followed, each pulled into his trap with a different lie. In that basement, they were stripped of everything: freedom, dignity, and even time itself. Days blended into nights and months blurred into years. But despite the horrors, they found strength. Emily scratched marks on the walls to count the days. Rachel whispered stories to keep their hope alive. And Sarah clung to a memory of her family, replaying it like a song in her head. They promised each other they'd survive, even when it felt impossible. After years of darkness, a sliver of light appeared. Literally. One morning in May 2013, Arthur forgot to lock the main door before leaving. Rachel saw the chance and knew it might be their only shot. Her heart pounded as she crept up the stairs. The door was slightly ajar and sunlight poured in like a miracle. She opened it and screamed as loud as she could, "Help! Please! Someone help us!" Her voice cracked, but she kept yelling. A neighbor heard her cries. "Stay right there!" he shouted, running toward the house. With a crowbar he found nearby, he forced the door open, revealing Rachel, trembling but determined, and the horrors behind her. Minutes later, the police arrived. Sarah and Emily were carried out, their faces pale but filled with tears of relief. It was the end of their nightmare, but the beginning of their fight to heal. Stories like this remind us of the power of courage and humanity. If you've made it this far, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these deserve to be shared. Arthur Caldwell was arrested that same day, and the truth came out. The trial was swift. Evidence from the basement painted a clear picture of his crimes. He was sentenced to over 1,000 years in prison, a sentence that seemed almost symbolic, his punishment for every stolen day. But the damage couldn't be undone. Emily, Rachel, and Sarah faced a long road ahead. The media frenzy, the flashbulbs of cameras, it was overwhelming. Yet their resilience never wavered. They leaned on each other and began to rebuild their lives, piece by piece. Arthur didn't last long in prison. A month after his sentencing, he took his own life. Some called it justice, others saw it as an escape. But for the women, it meant one less shadow haunting their future. When I think about this story, it's a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, but also admiration for their strength. It's a reminder of how important it is to look out for one another. So the next time you hear something that feels off, or see someone in need, don't hesitate. You might just be their only chance. You ever find something so strange that it just refuses to leave your mind? Like it latches onto you, begging you to figure out what it means? That's exactly what happened to me not long ago, and let me tell you, if I knew what was coming, I would have just walked away. Hey, I'm Mike, just a regular guy who's into old books, weird mysteries, and sometimes poking around in places I probably shouldn't. I grew up in a small town near the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota. Quiet place. Nothing ever really happens there, until it does. It all started in my parents' attic. I was cleaning out some boxes, looking for anything worth selling at the local flea market, when I stumbled on this old, leather-bound journal. The thing looked ancient with its cracked cover and yellowed pages. Written on the first page were the words, Elijah Hale, 1937. That name rang a bell. He was some loner who lived deep in the woods and disappeared decades ago. People said he went crazy, but no one knew why. The journal, though? That was the real mystery. As I read, I found myself drawn into his world. Elijah described strange voices coming from the basement of an abandoned cabin in the forest. He claimed the voices weren't just random, they were begging for help, pleading for someone to free them. But here's the kicker. He also said something darker was controlling them, something that wanted to stay hidden. Curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't just ignore it. I called up my friends, Tyler, Emma, and Rachel. Tyler's the guy who always doubts everything. He's the skeptic. Emma, she's all about ghost stories and paranormal stuff. She runs a little blog about haunted places. And Rachel? She's quiet, but she's got this weird ability to sense things, energies, vibes, whatever you want to call it. I told them about the journal, and Emma lit up like a Christmas tree. "We have to find this cabin," she said. Tyler rolled his eyes, of course. Rachel didn't say much, but I could tell she was uneasy. The next day, we headed into the woods, following the rough map Elijah had sketched in the journal. It wasn't easy, thick trees, overgrown trails, but eventually, we found it, a crumbling cabin tucked away like a secret nobody was meant to find. The cabin looked wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. The roof sagged, the walls were stained black with mold, and the air around it felt colder than it should have been. Emma was the first to step inside, flashlight in hand. The place smelled like damp earth and decay. "This is it," she whispered, her voice almost reverent. She pointed to a door at the back, partially hidden under debris. "The basement's through there." The stairs creaked with every step as we descended, our flashlights slicing through the darkness. The basement was worse than the cabin. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and the smell of rot was almost unbearable. That's when Rachel froze. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. At first I thought she was imagining things, but then I heard it too. Soft whispers like a dozen voices speaking at once. It wasn't clear what they were saying, but it sounded desperate. Emma started recording with her phone. "This is incredible," she whispered. "I can't wait to—" A loud bang cut her off. Something had fallen in the corner, though nothing should have been able to move. Tyler, ever the skeptic, muttered, "Probably just a rat." But even he looked spooked. As we explored further, we found strange symbols carved into the walls, circles, spirals, and what looked like handprints made by children. Emma shined her flashlight on one of them. "This is disturbing," she said. Rachel suddenly gasped and grabbed my arm. "There's something here. I can feel it. It's watching us." We moved toward the far end of the basement, where Elijah's journal had said a secret compartment could be found. Sure enough, hidden behind a loose brick, we discovered a small wooden box. Inside were tapes, old dusty cassette tapes labeled with dates from the 1930s. We played one. The voice on the tape, presumably Elijah's, was shaky and strained. "They called to me," he said, "but I know better now. They're not children. They're not human. They belong to it, and it will never let them go." Suddenly, Emma gasped. Her phone, still recording, started glitching, the screen flickering with static. She looked at me, wide-eyed. "Mike, this is insane. If people watching this don't believe us, they're missing out. Guys, subscribe to the channel and like this video because this is just the beginning." The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. And that's when we realized the stairs were gone. The whispers became a roar, swirling around us like a storm. The stairs were gone, as if the basement itself had swallowed them. Tyler slammed his fists against the wall, yelling, "This isn't possible! How do stairs just disappear?" But deep down, we all knew. This wasn't just some old basement, it wanted us here. Rachel, clutching her head, whispered, "It's feeding on us. Our fear, our presence." Her voice trembled, and tears streamed down her face. We need to stop it or it won't let us leave. The tapes, they were the key. I fumbled with the old recorder we'd found and played another one. Elijah's voice crackled through the speaker, more frantic this time. It demands a soul. One must stay to keep the others free. If not, it'll take them all. Emma froze. What does he mean, stay? Like, forever? None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we knew. The whispers, the presence, the entire basement, it was alive and it demanded a sacrifice. Tyler, ever the skeptic, shook his head. This is crazy. We can't just... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes wide with terror. Something had grabbed his ankle, yanking him toward the dark corner of the room. He kicked and screamed, but whatever it was dragged him faster. We rushed to pull him free, and that's when we saw it. A shadow, darker than the pitch black around us, with long, twisting limbs. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a hollow void. Rachel screamed, "It's coming for us all." I don't know what came over me, but I knew I had to act. "Go," I shouted. "Find another way out, I'll hold it here." "No." Emma grabbed my arm. "You can't. There's no other way." I cut her off, shoving the recorder into her hands. "Take the tapes. People need to know what happened here. Just go." Rachel hesitated, tears in her eyes, but she pulled Emma toward the far wall. "We'll find you a way out," she cried, but we both knew it was a lie. The thing moved closer, its limbs stretching toward me. I grabbed the lighter from my pocket and held it up. "You want me?" I said, my voice shaking. "Come and get me." The flame caught on the moldy, rotted beam, spreading fast. Fire raced across the walls, devouring the wooden symbols and peeling paint. The whispers turned into screams, high-pitched and furious. Emma and Rachel found a broken window and scrambled out just as the fire consumed everything. I stayed behind, watching the shadow writhe and twist in the flames. It screeched, louder than anything I'd ever heard, until it finally stopped. The last thing I saw was the cabin collapsing around me. I wish I could tell you that was the end, but it wasn't. Weeks later, Emma sent me a link to a news article. Someone had found a burned journal in the forest, tucked away under the ashes of the cabin. The article said it belonged to Elijah Hale, and there was a picture of a young boy holding the journal with a curious look in his eyes. The whispers weren't gone. They were just waiting for the next chapter to begin.